welcome to our panelists we have with us today. I'll start with Nishant. Nishant Bharadwaj is a global sector lead, renewable energy, and a deputy director at the Global Green Growth Institute. Nishant brings a vast amount of experience in renewable energy and power systems, power reforms, and infrastructure finance. He has worked with multilateral trust funds. He has developed institutional partnerships and influenced policy reforms. Thanks, Nishant, for being there. A very warm welcome to you. I then have Dr. Dhruba Purkayastha, who's the India Director for Climate Policy Initiative. Dhruba, in his earlier role, has also been a program manager with both the IFC and the World Bank. And he brings a very strong background in infrastructure and climate finance, credit ratings, infrastructure advisory, and development financing. Wonderful to have you on the panel, Dhruba. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we have Hitesh Sachdeva, my colleague and partner, infrastructure M&A at KPMG in India. Hitesh brings a fair bit of experience in looking at marquee transactions in renewables and power sector. He also brings a lot of experience in looking at the whole energy financing gamut, having deeply engaged and worked with PFC, REC, and other DFIs. And he will bring the infrastructure financing angle and the private developer angle to the panel. A warm welcome to all of you once again. I'm hoping we will also get the Joint Secretary, Department of Economic Affairs, Government of India, Mr. Piyush Kumar, as we move forward on the roundtable. We will get him in shortly. So with that introduction and background to this panel, let me just kick off proceedings with a very brief context setting for this roundtable. I'm going to keep this really, really brief because we have a lot to cover. I think essentially, 3 points. When it comes to, accessing green finance, basically there are three challenges or issues that we confront. I think the first is at an aggregate, green finance supply trails demand globally and in India. By some estimates, we have a requirement of investment of the order of about $10 trillion to meet our net zero ambition, and over $1 trillion even to get to our 2030 targets. Actual financing flows, by comparison, has been estimated at between a quarter and a third of this number. And so there is an absolute gap which is sizable. But more importantly, large chunks of the climate finance requirement is in areas which are outside the realms of bankability at this point in time. Yes, we have done very well in making renewables significantly amenable for commercial financing. And over the last several years, India has managed to get a lot of private financing flows. In fact, its commercial financing has become almost second nature in the renewable space. But as we move into low carbon hydrogen, industrial decarbonization, areas like these, the technology roadmaps are still evolving, and the configuration of financing pathways becomes a lot more challenging. Similarly is the case with adaptation financing. So one, there is an absolute gap. And second, there is a bankability question in many of the areas. And third, which is more a near-term, medium-term challenge, because of recent shocks, including COVID and the Ukraine crisis, there has been a lot of near-term headwinds, which also dent the medium-term trajectory. So that's the backdrop in which we are discussing this important issue. And with over a fifth of the global population, India's progress on climate change, on transitioning, has global ramifications. I take a half glass full view and think that India has started the journey really well. There is clearly intent in policy. We've seen the COP27 declaration of India's long-term strategy for transition. We've also seen the sovereign green bonds framework being launched last week. There have also been initiatives at scale, be it renewables, biofuels, green hydrogen, etc. And we're starting to see tangible positive outcomes out of some of these. So it's a half glass full. There are challenges to overcome, but there is progress in what we have done. So with that background and context, I thought, let me bring our panelists right into this discussion. Let me start with you, Nishant. Like I mentioned, we have a situation where there is areas where there is commercial finance amenability like renewables. But we are also seeing that we need to move very fast on areas like green hydrogen, areas like biofuels, where the path to financing is a little more hazy. There are viability gaps, and uh, banks and financial institutions are not very comfortable lending to projects which involve these areas. So, wanted to pick your brains on, uh, given that you have been doing a lot of work in these areas, what are some of the things we can do to start configuring uh, commercial financing pathways to some of these areas? Let me start with that.
Uh, Thank you for the introduction. Greetings to all the panelists, and thank you for having me here. Um, that's a great question, Anand. And I think these emerging technologies that you mentioned, like green hydrogen, I would add things like floating solar, things like storage, energy storage, all these technologies that are emerging, they still do not make a business case for private sector investments, not only just in India, but in large number of political economic landscapes and in other countries. Uh, One of the important thing is that because these are emerging technologies have not achieved the economies of scale, the prices are really high. But at the same time, the use case also need to be established in many of these technologies. From the financing point of view, I think what needs to happen going forward for these technologies, because the viability gap funding can only happen for a smaller part of the ecosystem development. What needs to happen is to develop mechanisms, especially for developing countries. It becomes more important in the case of developing countries because they have to develop and decarbonize at the same time, and therefore these technologies becomes very, very important. So we have to find innovative ways of bridging these financing gaps that we have. You talked about green hydrogen. Let me just start with that. The green hydrogen is available at a price of somewhere $7 to $8 per kg, whereas the gray hydrogen that we are trying to replace is available at $2 per kg to $2.50 per kg. The difference is so big. Even if you bring in the policy incentives and other kinds of incentives, the price gap that could be covered is like 30-40%. But the gap is quite big, so we have to think very differently. So just to give you an example of how we can do that, we Global Green Growth Institute, as an intergovernmental organization and as advisors to the governments, what we have done is to partner with organizations like World Bank to develop an institutional and financial mechanism to bridge the gap between gray and green hydrogen, which essentially means that if the producer wants green hydrogen at $7 and the user wants at $2.50, both these entities or the important stakeholder get at that price, and this mechanism would absorb that cost. That doesn't mean that it has to be a viability gap funding. It has to bring in number of instruments as part of this mechanism, which could be results-based financing, carbon financing, looking at the arbitrage that is available in different markets, and how this mechanism would work in the shorter run before we achieve the economies of scale and we get a parity between gray and green. So the need is more immediate for large number of countries for these technologies, and therefore the role of different kinds of financing becomes very, very important, and that should be made available to these countries. So let me stop here, Anand, and see if you have.
Yeah, I think that's very useful. So basically, what you're saying is that the gap cannot be addressed only through public viability gap sources and needs to sort of get addressed with other mechanisms. You spoke of results-based financing, and you also mentioned carbon markets, briefly alluded to that. And so some of these aspects will need to come into play, is the point you're making. Any quick point rejoinder on that, Dhruba, before I go to Hitesh for my next question?
No, I'll come in after you call me.
Okay. Hitesh, I'm going to move to the exact, opposite end of the spectrum. You've been doing a lot of work around renewable sector, and you've been looking at several M&A transactions as well. And no doubts that India has done remarkably over the last 5-7 years in terms of, creating an environment for large renewable developers to come in. We've also seen a lot of foreign capital coming in, both through the sovereign wealth funds and other pension funds starting to show interest in these areas. Now, the ecosystem seems to have matured quite significantly over the last few years. Now, nevertheless, the challenge before us is that, we've grown fivefold or whatever over the last 10 years. We got to grow another threefold by 2030. So from 140, 150 gigs, we're talking of moving to about 500 gigawatts. And it's not just a relative 3x thing, but also the absolute value of capacity added. It's about 250, 300 gigawatts of capacity over the next 7-8 years. The question I have for you is, in terms of the ecosystem, what we have from a financing ecosystem perspective, is that sufficient supply side? And on the demand side, what are some of the actionables we need to put in place to reach that? Because what got us here is possibly not going to get us to where we want to go. So just thought I'll check with you on what are some of the critical actionables you think are needed to get us there.
Thanks, Anand, for that question, and greetings to all my fellow panelists. I think, in my view, if you think about this whole equity and debt activity into the Indian renewable markets, and let's call it mainstream renewable market, because that is where most of the action has been. So broadly, a lot of renewable brownfield stock has moved to the hands of the private equity funds, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, etc. And the capital options are fairly large. There have been multiple levers. I think it's a very long answer, but I will try to keep it as brief as possible. There have been multiple interventions. I think the first intervention and the foremost has been the power market design. Historically, you had DISCOM exposed power sale agreements, and then this brilliant idea of having SECI in the middle was mooted. Now, as soon as Solar Energy Corporation of India came in, one of the major risks that investors perceived in the Indian market, that the payment security mechanism itself, the delay payment issues, all of those were obviated. And here you had a central counterparty who was more than willing to sort of backstop the PPA and the payment security to that extent. So the credit quality of the asset improved tremendously. And given the improvement in the financial quality, I think all of the investors, and there are investors of various asset classes, so yield investors and so on and so forth, these investors started to like the yield play. And if you see now, renewables is becoming more of a yield play. I think if you take out one or two listed entities which are playing the growth multiple in the renewable markets, most of the investors, particularly financial in nature, most of them actually migrated to the yield model. Now, I think the question in front of the policymakers is that how robust is SECI model for, let's say today SECI is contracted for 50 to 60 gigawatt. The question you have to really answer is, do we have many SECIs? Do we have state SECIs? Or how robust is the SECI model for the next 400 gigawatt? I think that is the moot question, and I think it will take us a full panel discussion to answer that. But to my mind, SECI needs to be capitalized. The payment security of SECI needs to be shored up, and a lot more actions need to be taken in this dimension. So I think the first is power market design. The second is the tax design. Essentially, when the investors are seeking yield, can you seamlessly generate that yield flow back to the investor? I think the government deserves congratulations. I think the JS is going to join, but the InvIT model is working out really well. We have seen at least one InvIT already in the RE markets, and a lot of investors are today entering the market with a view that we will do more InvITs. I think the question really will be that how could you have a white label InvIT? Could you do different permutations and combinations? I think that would basically propel the market forward. The third question, and I think I will just pause after the third element of what I have to say, is the debt markets. So while we are, I think and insofar as debt and also insofar as your InvITs are concerned, it is I think there is no path forward, and we did some work with Ministry of Finance on this. There is little path forward. We are always focusing on inviting foreign investment, but our domestic investments into these instruments still continue to be at very, very low levels. So I think at some point in the panel discussion in this roundtable, we must also talk about the fact that how do we encourage more domestic capital, our own provident fund, our own pension funds. I think how does this capital find its way into the renewable ecosystem? I think that would lead to multiplication of capital. Thanks, Anand.
Thank you. Great points. I think you spoke about counterparty risk, and I mean, obviously, SECI was probably brought in as a stopgap, and it's become an albatross in that sense, that unless and until the DISCOMs start functioning as they ought to, how longer a leash can SECI provide? Great point there. And you spoke about the variety of instruments, including InvITs coming into play, and the need for tax and yield related issues. Great points there. I think so. We've sort of looked at even in areas where commercial financing has been a big play over the years, we see that there are challenges, and new areas, as Nishant spoke of, will need completely new mechanisms as well. Dhruba, I'll bring you in here. You've been, writing a lot and also sort of speaking about the whole aspect of dealing with elevated risks of climate finance, while also expanding for climate finance. I mean, I read one of your papers where you bring out this fact that, as we expand climate finance, the challenge for banks and financial institutions is that, you are handling a bunch of elevated risk assets, which raises the risks for financial institutions, and there is nervousness in the financial institutions. And you spoke of the need to reconcile these two, increasing green finance through a regulatory diktat, but also bringing risk management. What are some of the ways in which you think this can be really operationalized? It's a very tricky conundrum, really, right? And what are some of the pathways you see globally and in India to address this, particularly with respect to debt financing?
Yeah, thank you, Anand. Very relevant. Thank you, KPMG, for giving the opportunity for me to speak in this session. While agreeing with Nishant and picking up from where Hitesh left, leading to your question, give me a minute to step back on where you started, Anand. While mainstream renewables have bankability, they are getting financed, and they are again churning through InvITs to the capital markets, which is what my co-panelist said, and which is right and which is correct. We are talking about a gap in green finance. And let me explain this concept of gap. We assume that there is a supply of green finance. But what we measure is, science has told India or the world needs to make so much of investments in mitigation and adaptation. I'm not a scientist. I believe what IPCC says. So IPCC says this. India's NDC has put up, without questioning numbers, India's NDC says we make those investments. We need 160 billion a year to be invested. As an institution, we track climate finance across the world, green finance across the world. India, we call it green finance. I'll come to the nuances later. Therefore, we find this gap, which you're absolutely right, between required investment and what is happening. And one quarter, roughly 44 billion was what we tracked last for India. Now, globally, the numbers are even huge. 2.5 trillion, 3 trillion, this COP says 6 trillion. So without getting into the order of magnitude, the tracked amount seems to be of the order of 600 to 700 billion. Yes, so the gap is clear. While we use green and climate interchangeably, in a very strict context, climate is mitigation and adaptation. So whatever money goes into mitigation, renewable energy, EVs, clean transport, energy efficiency, part of it into forests, which is called REDD. Rest of it is adaptation, built infrastructure, health, ecosystem, and the rest of what humanity needs to adapt to face climate change. So that is your adaptation is scooping up. Now let's get to finance. Before I get to your question is pretty relevant. What you're basically saying is, yes, okay. So as the requirement to increase green finance comes in, so there are two parts to the whole problem. Increase green finance and green your financial system. There are two different ways of looking at the problem. As you increase green finance, regulation and policy in India is the classic old PSL, you direct finance towards because you want money to go there. So you push that. India is more banking than capital markets, right? India is significantly more banking intermediation than capital market intermediation. Ideally, banking intermediation should circulate to the capital markets as green bonds and green InvITs and so on. And that's the best thing for banking balance sheets to get released. So you have to, so the crux, tax comes in, incentives comes in, all of it comes in towards increasing green finance. I will shift the argument here from the real sector to the financial sector. When you get to the financial sector and the bank, they're basically telling the bank, assume those higher risks of green. Not only assume those higher risks for the green, there is also an issue of what is now getting recognized as climate risk. What is climate risk? Climate risk is physical risk and transition risk. Just to give you an example and make it as simple as possible. So I have physical risk, and what is physical risk? More water, more rain, more floods, more storms. So you have to save yourself there. Part of it is adaptation. But let's understand commercial finance there, factory locations there, businesses over there, all of them subject to this. So therefore, the physical part of climate risk is very much mapped. So you know at a lat-long level, what is the physical risk there? So that is distinct from increasing green finance. Now you come to another issue. You have a pressure and you have a push of doing that transition. I'll give you an extreme picture of transition. Tomorrow, the government decides to say no more IC engine vehicles. What happens to the EMIs for all the auto finance? This is a classic point of transition risk. So as you move away from coal, fossil fuels, etc., your existing assets are subject to transition risk. You put them two together, and after a lot of debate, I think now the picture is like, okay, we have NGFS and somebody has been given the responsibility to chart out. Basel is taking and giving out some form of pathway, but we still do not know. In simple parlance, it is climate-related financial risk. So effectively what is happening for the bank is credit risk, market risk, operational risk, all of them seem to have a layer of climate risk, which is adding on to it, and therefore additional capital possibly is required to protect against that capital adequacy. And if you go to a bank, the bank is saying, what is that number? Give me that number that I need to provide. When you number that you need to provide, then what happens? Either you price your risk, what is your religion of finance? And I'm sure my co-panelists will agree, I have to do risk-based pricing. So here is higher risk, and not only higher risk, set aside additional capital. So therefore my price of money increases. Regulation and policymaker. policymaker desires that money should go to EVs, money should go to energy efficiency, money should go to this new technologies, hydrogen, storage, rightly so. No denying the fact, rightly so. But as you move money forward to this, you can move it, one, there is no dedicated pot of money, whether it is with the bank or with the capital markets, which is called quote unquote green.
Right.
If I total up all the dedicated funds globally, and I will give you the numbers, the total dedicated green climate funds will not add up to $50 billion. Now you have a pot of $50 billion, of which 12 billion is GCF, by the way.
Right.
Now, and you have investments required here. So yes, it's a fine balance between moving towards increasing green finance and managing associated incremental climate-related financial risk, which is naturally arising from physical risk and from transition risk. I'll pause here.
I think great points. Again, I think we built up from the renewable and the difficult sectors to look at financing system as a whole and the issues that arise out of climate risks, financing risks, and also the elevated risk of funding new initiatives. So I think that conundrum, resolving that, one of the questions I'd like to take to both, let's say maybe I'll start with Dhruba and Nishant on this. One thing which we have seen is that DFIs have been played a big role in the whole climate financing thing. Even reports of yours, Dhruba, talk of a large chunk of climate financing flows coming from the DFIs, national DFIs largely. India has had its share of national DFIs like the PFCs, RECs, and now NAPFID. Is there something that these agencies or these institutions could collectively or separately do to partly address this problem? I mean, by either say, having a higher capitalized, larger DFI part, given the higher elevated risks, to sort of somewhat insulate the banking sector, and two, also provide for building, capabilities around things like appraisal and so on. I will hold on to that thought for a minute. I see Mr. Piyush Kumar joining in. So we'll just take a pause on that question. Dhruba, I'll come back to you.
Yeah.
Very good afternoon to you, sir, and good to have you on the panel.
Good afternoon. Thank you, and sorry for the disruption. Suddenly, important meeting came, so I had to be somewhat late to crash in at a later point. Yeah, please tell me.
No worries, sir. Thank you very much. I have pleasure in welcoming Mr. Piyush Kumar, Joint Secretary, Department of Economic Affairs, Government of India. He leads the initiatives in the Infrastructure Finance Secretariat, which is the nodal body of Government of India for all the infrastructure build out that the Government of India has been doing. Notably, with respect to this panel discussion, I'll also bring home the point that he's been behind the recently launched sovereign green bonds framework by Government of India. So it's a very opportune time, sir, to get you on board on this panel. So very warm welcome to you, and thanks again for being on the panel. So what we've been doing is, since you took some time coming in from your other commitments, we started the discussion around the key challenges in financing the climate agenda for Government of India, and have some points thrown up by our panelists. I hope we can share that over a recording with you, sir, for your consumption. But quickly, what I thought I will do, given you have a pressing time commitment, I thought I'll come to you directly on some of Government of India's initiatives and pick some of the questions with you right away. So my first question, by obvious choice, given it's recent, is around the sovereign green bonds framework that Government of India has come out with, and would like if you could throw some light on some detail around that, the plans around the green bond framework, and I can come in with questions after that.
Yeah, thank you, Anand. Thank you for accommodating the slight change in schedule. I also extend a very warm afternoon and evening to all the co-panelists. Thank you. And again, that's an important point. As you're aware that to further the green financing, this year budget, we have the finance minister has laid down the path for issuance of sovereign green bonds. So when we talk about sovereign green bonds, it essentially means that all the public funded projects which are related to environment and which further the green agenda in some sense should be financed through a dedicated debt instrument on the green bonds. So that was the announcement. With that, the Ministry of Finance got into action for implementing the announcement. And first point was, to in order to have a green bond green bonds issuance, we looked at, and then we realized that under the green bond financing, we are looking at a niche class of investors. And to have their confidence, we worked upon a framework for green bond finance. So that was an exercise that we took 3 months time to get in. We had from the government side brought in Ministry of Environment, the expert body, and also the NITI think tank, and some experts within the the Ministry of Finance. We have climate finance unit, CCFU, along with the Treasury, the budget division, which was working upon it, and then my team here, which is led by experts and knowledge partner, which is also there. So with them, we worked out. We were looking at laying down this framework for green financing. Now that part exercise we took up. We looked around. Many of the in the world, many countries have come out with a framework. In India, we did not have it. So of course, we have different conventions and different standards benchmark. We had to collate together and then bring out a framework. So under the framework, we have looked at what kind of projects can be financed and what is the nature of funding mechanism that we are looking at, the investor class that we are targeting, and also we have also laid down internal finance ministry drawn from other ministries, a committee, a green finance working committee, which will work around this thing. So that work we have now completed. We had also approached a second party opinion, which is CISRO, a very reputed organization which rates the framework and different bonds that we issue under the framework. And we have got a medium green rating, which is a fairly good rating as compared to many of the developed countries have. In India, as a growing economy, we had our set of challenges. So with that, I think this is a good rating that we got, and now we are ready to hit the market.
Fantastic, sir. Good to hear that progress on the whole sovereign green bonds framework. I understand from press releases that you're looking at about a 16,000 crores worth of issuances even during this financial year. Is that correct?
That's correct. So that is this is a long-term thing. I mean, it is not something.
Absolutely, sir. Absolutely. I was going to come to that.
Yeah, what we are looking at is creating a market here. And as a first exercise this year, the market calendar, there's a regular government borrowing program with RBI and with in the Ministry of Finance we issue. In that, for this year, we are looking at 16,000 crore, which is roughly around. Why 16,000 crore? Because about $2 billion is what we were looking at, and therefore. And that's a starting point. So now with the framework in place, now we are ready to get going on that. So this year we'll meet that target, and then we'll be taking it further from there.
No, absolutely wonderful to hear that, sir. This is going to take me to my next related question, which is, what we're seeing everywhere, sir, is that, for crowding in private financing, a certain threshold level of public finance becomes absolutely critical and necessary. And it's wonderful to see that Government of India has taken the step forward to get this whole sovereign bond program get going, which will obviously probably augment the public resources, also budgetary outlays. So one of the questions I had was, given that the numbers being put out for meeting our net zero ambition is of the order of a few $1 trillion and translates something like 3 to 4% of our GDP. Two related questions come up, sir. One is in terms of how do we step up public finance outlays on a regular basis? Hello.
Yeah, please go ahead. Go ahead.
So how do we sort of step up public finance outlays, and is there a medium-term target of increasing public financing outlays that you're looking at? And a related question is, given that a lot of overlaps are there with respect to spending between climate finance and the way functionally your budget is organized, is there also a plan to disclose a climate finance budget as part of the Government of India budget was a second question. So these are related. Is there a plan to step up climate finance? And B, from a reporting disclosure perspective, are you also looking at a separate climate finance reporting under the budget?
So good question, and so point is that as you have pointed out, for any ecosystem to thrive, to sustain public financing public funding is the first thing to trigger that to develop a deep enough market where then individual borrowers can come on and exchange on and have access to these kind of funds with a growing awareness about around the environment concerns globally and elsewhere. So there is definitely a class of investor which is looking at financing many of these green projects. A conventional understanding also says that when you move from conventional mode of financing to look at green financing, they will be in the immediate term they will cost slightly more. Of course, the economic benefit or the environment benefit are far more, but nonetheless the fact remains that immediately it will require certain higher financing. It also involves change in technology, change in manner in which we are doing some of the traditional things, and therefore the costing comes slightly higher, and that is the reason why we need a lower cost of financing for these initiatives. It is with this objective, globally also there have been funds created. There are deeper funds which are sovereign funds or environment purely dedicated funds which are looking at financing the green initiatives across the globe. Now, for mechanism in order to establish a system in which the investors can be matched with these projects and their financing can happen, we have to develop a market, we have to develop a system. And as you rightly pointed out, it is the government or the public financing that has to take the lead. And it is with this objective, when you talk of total Government of India borrowing, it is of the order of 15 lakh or 15 trillion, in rupee terms. So it's a huge market borrowing. So compared to that, this may be a very peanut or a minuscule portion. But what it does is that in the process, it creates certain systems. And tomorrow there could be exchange on which retail investors could also possibly take up green bonds, and that can be traded, and whole ecosystem can be developed around. So it was with these objectives that we were looking at financing these funds, and as we go forward, this is a small a baby step towards developing a fully vibrant green market, where some financing and matching can happen between the projects, the borrowers and the lenders on this platform. So that is the objective. As I told you, that we have come out with a framework, and the framework itself entails certain amount of disclosures. When we go to SEBI, and regulations itself require that when you're talking of green financing, what are the projects, what is exact metrics in which we measure the benefits, and when we classify certain category of projects to be taken up, what are those norms? So as we go along, we are discovering and we are creating that market and that ecosystem. So that is the objective, and with those disclosures, and as we develop more and more projects, and we develop more of these matrices, then a system will be laid in which we will have a fuller market operating, and fully private projects and borrowings can also utilize these vehicles to fund the projects. Now, insofar as your second part of the question, green environmental projects are the whole objective of the issuance of sovereign green bond is to give some kind of a special treatment to green projects. So that is the objective where we develop it. We are not looking at a separate green budgeting exercise as such, but definitely as part of this, the green bond itself will require a separate account to be maintained and.
So we are losing your voice, I think.
A separate paper or a report to be there. I think some connectivity problem. So as I was saying, telling you that the process itself will entail, when you have in public account, we have a special mechanism for green bond financing that will itself require certain reports to be laid in the parliament, and from the CAG point of view, certain audits, and SEBI regulations point of view, certain disclosures. So these will create a system which will be better able to appreciate the environmental benefits of some of these projects and disclosures. So going forward, definitely this will lead into special reports and special accounting and special reporting in terms of the budgeting thing. At this stage, we are looking at developing this thing, and next in coming 2-3 years, when this is a more we have more on the portfolio, then many of these things will be developing.
So one of the things we were speaking just before you came in, it was very timely. So I'm asking this question. I was putting this question to some of our panelists as well, which is in terms of, I mean, given the debt has been a very large, portion of climate financing flows overall, and DFIs, financing institutions, domestic financing institutions have been a very key player. We in India also have quite a few of the public financing institutions, including the likes of PFC, REC, and now NAPFID, IFCL in the past, all sort of contributing to the overall infrastructure agenda. Of course, now all of them are getting a green, label. One of the things I wanted to check with you, sir, was: is there any specific initiatives that you're looking at to sort of scale green financing through these institutions? Because at some level, given that, in fact, the panelists also brought home the fact that while renewables commercial financing has been, we've been able to scale that up for green hydrogen, carbon storage, etc., bankability is still a challenge. So can DFIs come and, sort of support, because the more the merrier, you need more players to come in. So any thoughts on what you see in terms of the whole DFI network within the Government of India, and any plans for that, sir?
Again, that's again a good point. I mean, as we develop, as I was telling you, this is the step that we are taking, the first step, and there are many things that are going to come. Given the fact that the concerns around green financing will continue, and there will be increasingly more focus on green financing instruments. Definitely, this is something which will be developed as we go, developing as we go along. Now, in terms of financing, NAPFID definitely has within its scope, it can tie up with some of the international financing organizations and create some funds. And IF has been, as a fund has been looking at it, and therefore, there have been various proposals coming in from different ministries and different sides that we need to have a special vehicle to finance some of these initiatives. There are many. I mean, something which are pure play, like MNRE itself. Anything that is done in MNRE is in that direction. In the conventional, like urban infrastructure or urban transport, if you talk, when you're talking of electric buses or electric, so there's a carbon footprint, or there's a definite direct correlation to environment, improvement. So in the conventional, there are certain category or subset of projects which directly impinge upon this thing, and there are certain categories which are directly as a whole, lock, stock, and barrel, they can be classified there. When you talk of metro projects, the fact that public transport share increases, or the private vehicles footprints come down, so that itself has a indirect impact or benefit on the carbon release of emissions coming down. So there are both categories. In the conventional, there are certain.
So we're losing you a bit, sir. Hello. I think we've lost his line. We'll give it a minute. Yes, sir. We lost you briefly. Can you hear us?
This meeting is being recorded.
Sorry, I think it got hang. Yeah.
We got you back, sir.
Yeah. Now, am I audible, visible?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. As I saying that, as there are funds which are in different proposals from different ministries which are coming in. And as we develop, as I was saying, this is a first step. As we go along, there's definitely a room for developing many of these instruments and using DFIs and many other, approaches to it.
So on that thought, I'm going to now, sir, going to take 3 questions with our 3 panelists, and I'm going to come back to you for a last question for a wrap. So Dhruva, picking up from what Joint Secretary sir mentioned, one of the things you mentioned while speaking was that banks, capital markets, that linkage is something we need to build much more strongly so that banks can recycle capital. What is the kind of role, quickly, in a couple of 2 or 3 points, that you think that the DFI can play, and some inputs we can sort of give on that front? That will be useful.
No, thanks, Anand. Independent of green or infrastructure or any finance, It starts with bank finance and then you some way securitize and transfer it to capital markets. The question here is, it is high risk at the start of the financing. If I go beyond renewable, the price is higher. The only way, in my mind, in terms of green issuances, is you have to reduce the coupon by pricing carbon. That's the equilibrium at which issuances will work. Now, how do you work that out? If you look at India, I'll just explain this. India has not only met NDC, India has revised NDC. Revised NDC to 50%, 49%, revised NDC to 500 gigawatt, now 550% share of electricity. So what I'm basically net saying is, international capital flows of what Government of India calls climate finance is finance that should ideally come to developing countries for doing more than what they have already done or they should do, which is where the pricing of carbon becomes paramount. Now, whether Article 6 is resolved and you get a Kyoto-like mechanism between Article 6.2 and 4, or you do it through a DFIs, all I'm trying to say is the monetization of carbon mitigated with an equivalent coupon basis points reduces the coupon in which the issuances will happen. That's the equilibrium that you need to achieve.
Okay, I think that is something Nishant also alluded to right in the beginning when he spoke of mechanisms to sort of bridge that gap and having possibly carbon markets kind of come and play. Now, Hitesh, you've done a lot of work with PFC and REC in particular. Are you also seeing some of these play out in the work that they are doing?
Arun, I think we have to really think about the business model of PFC, REC, or any such commercial financial institution. I think on one hand, they have borrowings from capital markets. On the other hand, they are lending on this side. So you have liabilities on this side and you have assets on this side. And then you have between the channel, you need to make a spread. And then you need to find a very efficient way of making that stress spread. And then you need to have capacity. I think the challenge in any of these financial institutions and our domestic financial institutions, I would still not call them development finance institutions. I don't think they play part of that role, but broadly, they are still commercial finance institutions. Is there enough capacity to even assess risk? I think it is clear, and Dhruva pointed out, any financial institution or a bank is in the business of buying risk and mitigating that risk, finding ways. I would tend to believe that a significant effort will need to be made in building that capacity to assess the risk of lending to these projects or financing these projects. They might need more capital, but that's a secondary aspect. The first and foremost is to have that capacity.
To manage.
And even on this, the second part, I think whether how do you lower the coupon? I think this point we often miss. If you look at mainstream financing of a AAA company versus mainstream financing of a AAA green company, is there really a spread? And that takes me back to the point that Dhruva made right at the beginning, that is there real green or climate money really available in the market, which is willing to take 100, 200 bips cut on its return expectations and invest in the market or invest in a project? I think that's the first question. I think my current bet would be on the fact that actually there is hardly any investor who, everybody wants to say, I want to do green financing, but there is really no investor who is willing to take 100 bips cut on his investment in a normal mainstream consumer investment versus a green investment on this side. So I think that pricing of carbon is super crucial to have a market in which the liability side of these institutions is lowered, the cost of liability raising capital is lowered, and then you need to have capacity to translate that into action on this side. So I will stop it.
Yeah, thanks for that point. I think you're making the point that the greenium has to be there to sort of scale that side of the story. Excellent point. I'm going to have one question I'm going to put to Nishant and Dhruba before I'm going to come back to Mr. Piyush Kumar if he can join in. Nishant, the question I have is now, and Dhruba, since both of you have a multilateral flavor to your work in the past, what is that multilateral agencies can do better? They've been vested with a fairly large agenda with respect to the climate finance piece. What are a couple of things that they can do? I think the two levers we always speak of is upstream capacity and preparation. And the second is making the downstream multiplier better, which is for every dollar of multilateral money, can we get more private financing in play? So I just want you both, maybe Nishant, you can go first, and I'll probably ask Dhruba to, because this is one area where I think there is an opportunity to do a little more in a context or a country like India. So some thoughts on that.
Thank you, Anand. I think it's a very interesting discussion and very interesting question. So the role of multilaterals, or you can say the DFIs, if you like, is critical. And as you mentioned, the crowding and effect of the multilaterals are very important. For every dollar that they have, they need to mobilize the private sector investment. So you talked about the domestic DFIs, which are not really the DFIs as Hitesh mentioned. I think the DFIs, domestic and international, need to make up their mind. Are they going to finance the project as a whole, or they just put a portion of financing to attract the private sector investments into the project? So whole financing fabric needs to change. And the multilaterals need to play a more catalytic role in terms of attracting more private sector finance, because the public finance anyways is quite limited. The greenium that you talked about, I think that greenium would come in if these multilaterals agencies would take a much higher level of risk and provide comfort to the private sector. Guarantees is a good example. The guarantees can play a major role, whether the multilateral should actually get into mainstream financing or they should play a very catalytic role of providing guarantees is an important thought process. But having said that, I think touching on to some of the previous points that you mentioned, I think within India itself, the whole financing fabric needs to change if we need to have more capital in the green space. A large part of infrastructure is financed by the commercial banks, and they have an asset liability mismatch. So are they really the ones to finance the large infrastructure projects and lock themselves in? Dhruva talked about a natural cycle of securitization and passing it on to the capital market. But I think that we need to deepen the recycling market, both for debt and equity. And that's not happening in the case of renewable energy. That needs to happen quite quickly so that there is some kind of, I would say, recycling of capital. And that's where the multilateral agencies' role become very important.
Sorry, Nishant, complete your point.
One last point that you mentioned in upstream work, creating a pipeline of bankable projects is very important. Nobody wants to invest into those. Everyone wants to have a good quality projects, but who is going to create that pipeline of the real green projects that are made available, which has an acceptable risk profile? I think the multilaterals role become an extremely important there. And a large part of multilateral funding should be to create that pipeline of projects, which is quite limited at this point in time.
Okay, I'm really running short of time. I also wanted to bring Hitesh's point on the whole bringing domestic money in terms of the insurance and pension funds coming in also becomes an important part. But I think, sir, one critical question I have for you before we wrap and move to a closure. So you're there on the call, right? You can hear me.
Yeah, I'm there, but I have to be moving now. I have another meeting.
I just have one final question, sir. So we're also sort of wrapping this up. One final question I have is, given that state governments are contributing to almost 2/3 of the development expenditure in terms of if they take it as a total. Is there something being done, sir, to sort of bring states onto this agenda? There are some states which obviously have done well with respect to climate agenda, but is there some initiatives from the government of India to bring states onto this whole agenda about climate finance?
Yeah, as I was telling you that this is the first step, and my answer directly not yet, but indirectly yes, because all the projects that we finance under green bond ultimately will be going to the states, because
exactly,
every finance is the state. So the state starts getting the flavor of how it is to be done. But definitely going forward, as we develop more of this, states also have a huge borrowing program. So they also need to diversify and develop, these instruments to finance their funding requirement, especially in terms of environment concerns. Already, as part of any project, infrastructure or any big project, the requirement of environment studies and the component is already there. With the financing coming in from the green bond side, and once we develop more of from the central government side, the state governments will be looking forward and then should be developing it.
That's wonderful to hear, sir. And overall, it's been a fascinating discussion. Several points coming. We'll share a video of this since you were not there in the first part with you, sir, so that you have the benefit of the points that came in broadly. But what I'll probably do is take 2 minutes to summarize what I thought were some key takeaways. I think all of us sort of felt that there is a need for sizable public financing backed by institutional capacity and initiatives at scale, and we see your sovereign green bonds as one of the key cog in that philosophy. The second is we're seeing that there is a need for step up of risk capital of magnitude, and both Hitesh, Nishant, and Dhruba spoke about the need for more money to come and have greeniums differentials established, and that becomes a very critical aspect. We spoke about the regulatory nudge needed for debt financing, at the same time putting in place safeguards to manage elevated risks. The fourth area we spoke about, sir, is in terms of the role of multilateral agencies and how they can contribute significantly on two levers, particularly in terms of upstream support for project preparation and bankable pipeline creation, and also helping with instruments like guarantees to bring increased multiplier on investments. And finally, a much stronger, disclosure and taxonomy to ensure that all the climate finance flows are tracked effectively. So those were some of the points I can think of summarizing. Of course, you will have the video and you can look at it. It was an absolute pleasure, hosting this panel. For over 200 years, the world is sort of binged on fossil fuels for economic growth. And we have maybe about 2 to 3 decades to de-addict ourselves from this. And financing as a leading marker becomes extremely critical. And I hope this panel adds to the growing body of knowledge to tackle this challenge in the years and decades to come. Thank you so much, all of you. It was a pleasure having all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anand. And let me tell you that this is a very relevant topic that you have picked up. It is something which is very much at the the policymakers and at government level also important. And the points that in the little end part that I had listened was very interesting, to develop as we take it forward. And I look forward for your the earlier part of the discussion that will be helpful. Let me also mention here that I think KPMG team with in the infrastructure finance secretariat led by Aparajita played a very good role on that. And I think knowledge bodies like yours, I mean, these kind of discussions and your contributions are also good in that direction. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Pleasure having you all. Thank you once again.